I'm Andrea Levere. I'm the president of CFED, and it is my extraordinary pleasure to welcome you all today to be part of what we hope is going to be an ongoing series of provocative conversations, wonderful speakers, and terrific questions. So all of you are going to be chiming in with questions on topics related to asset building. This event is part of a very special relationship we have had with Democracy, a journal of ideas, and you will find on your seats, hopefully you're not still sitting on them, a copy of a very special symposium which we published in partnership with Democracy, really looking at what is the future of asset building and financial security in this country. We are incredibly lucky to have 3 of the authors of those articles who have joined us today. We'll introduce them in more detail, but I'm thrilled that we have a long-term friend with Jim Carr, one of CFED's board members with Sarah Rosen Wartell, and one CFED's former policy director and now long-term policy partner, Boshara. So I want to thank all of them for being here, and you'll hear more about them in a minute. We are very focused, as you know, today on issues of budgets and economics. And we're really consumed about what's going to happen over the next 4 weeks in terms of the fiscal situation in the United States. But really what we want to talk about today is what's going to happen over the next 4 years, because that's really the long-term work we're all engaged in. Perhaps the biggest battle is going to be to how we put the federal budget on track, but really what we're focused on is how do we bring American households back on track to build financial security. You've all seen these numbers multiple times. The Federal Reserve has told us that the recession wiped out 40% of Americans' net wealth. The Pew Economic Mobility Project tells us that low-income Americans saw 90% of their wealth wiped out in the Great Recession. And those of you who are avid followers of the Assets and Opportunities Scorecard know our newest metric called liquid asset poverty, which looks at the ability of a household to exist at the poverty level for 3 months if their main source of income is disrupted. It's really a measure of financial security. This year, for the very first time, we calculated a liquid asset poverty number which takes the value of the home, the car, or the business out of household net worth. 43% of American households live in liquid asset poverty, almost half of our households. And frankly, that changed the whole conversation, because suddenly we weren't just talking about those poor people, we were talking about half of us as we were thinking about how we build economic security. So we are focused on an environment where every dollar counts, and how we both save and invest those dollars are going to make a difference. Many of you know that CFED has been at the forefront of the asset building movement for over 3 decades. We have started with microenterprise and moved to match savings and moved to children's savings, and now really look at the whole field as a continuum, starting with financial inclusion and how you bring households into the financial mainstream, into wealth creation. We have looked at how to make low-income people save effectively and how to transfer that to their children. What we believe most seriously is that when people save and invest for their futures, it changes the way they think about themselves and their opportunities and their aspirations. And so we're really excited to have a conversation today which is going to bring all these issues to the fore. So let me begin by introducing our special speaker this morning. We are thrilled to have Senator Merkley of Oregon here to launch us off. I just had a moment to speak with him to learn how he was one of the very first asset advocates in America. We are very impressed by the work that's happened in Oregon from the very beginning. He has been a strong champion of all sorts of strategies to build financial security and opportunity for families in Oregon. He's a longtime leader of Oregon's Habitat for Humanity, and he designed the Habitat Home Building Center and launched a special pilot project to build Portland Youth Builders. Today, the state of Oregon has the largest statewide IDA, or Individual Development Account program, in the nation, with more than 4,000 accounts open since 2008. The Oregon IDA tax credit is the most generous in the nation, with $10 million authorized in 2012. And I told the Senator a few minutes ago that in the scorecard, part of the scorecard, is a policy agenda that we advocate for the states. And we have our top 12 policies on how we build assets. And we pick out the best policy on each of those 12 issues. And the Oregon State IDA program is the leading IDA policy in the nation. So now we know who to thank for that. In addition to formally serving as the Oregon House Speaker, he now serves on several of the Senate's most powerful committees that will be at the heart of the major debates today: health, education, labor, and pensions, housing, banking, housing, and urban affairs, environment and public works, and the budget, which I'm sure will be the most fun of all. So with that, it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to Senator Jeff Merkley.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for the introduction, but thank you even more for the work that Corporation for Enterprise Development has done over this last 30 years in all the different forms of asset development, encouragement, nurturing, and so forth. And I also want to pause and thank Democracy Journal as the co-sponsor of this gathering. And many of you may know, I see copies of Democracy Journal on the seats here, that it was Democracy Journal that published Elizabeth Warren's essay suggesting the creation of Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I am so delighted that you published that essay. Not only did I get a chance as a new senator to advocate on the Banking Committee for the establishment of the CFPB, but to advocate for Elizabeth to be brought in to help launch it, and then to encourage her to run for the Senate. And of course, you know that she has now been elected, and we have a terrific, powerful advocate with her arrival this coming January. So thank you to both organizations for the tremendous work you're doing in this effort to empower American families. I thought I'd go ahead and share with you all a little bit of the details about the story of how I got involved in asset building. When I was here in Washington, D.C. during the 1980s, I was working on strategic nuclear policy. And that's couldn't be further away from economic empowerment. But if you turn the clock back further in my resume, you'd find I studied third world economic development and had anticipated doing work in poor communities around the world as a career. And it just so happened that shortly after I graduated, I was here in D.C. at the World Bank, and I was offered a presidential fellowship to work on nuclear policy. And I thought, well, that's a really big issue too. On the one hand, it's about economic policies that empower families, whether in the third world or in America. On the other hand, we didn't want the world blown up, and so I diverted my direction for a decade while I worked with the Defense Department and then with Congress. But I just had to get back to Oregon, and so at a point when the administration was keeping the stealth bomber in the black classification so that I, as an analyst, couldn't write about it, even though you could check out books from the library on stealth policy, said, okay, it's time to get back to Oregon. And when I went back to Oregon, I found a position heading Portland's Habitat for Humanity, and was there from 91 through 94. just absolutely loved. I was familiar with the work of Habitat Humanity previously, and I'd participated in the Jimmy Carter Blitz build here in Washington, D.C. during the 1980s, and been following the activities. But that immersion in 3 years, seeing families really with their economic lives transformed through home ownership. And it wasn't just signing a paper and owning a home. It was the sweat equity that they put into the house. It was the partnerships that they created across traditional boundaries within society in the course of the house being built. It was the skills that they learned constructing the house. It was the training about financial education that they received that stabilized their family. And I saw children's lives changed through that economic empowerment. The stability, a family that had been living in a van or a basement or a series of friends' spare bedrooms, having a home of their own. There was I'm going to leap ahead to a family that recently bought a house through an IDA in Oregon. And the woman said the first thing she did upon getting her keys was to spend the whole night painting her bedroom a tone of earth green. She said, because I could. Because it was her house. And that's the same empowerment that I saw through Habitat's partnership. Well, after 3 years, I went to work as a housing developer for a group called Human Solutions. And the first apartment development that I completed was called Cedar Meadows. It was a traditional tax credit project. And I went out to Cedar Meadows, and the very first family was moving into a second-story apartment. And I walked up the stairs to greet the mother and ask her what she thought of the complex. And she said, oh, I'm so happy to be moving in here because, for one thing, you put in a playground. And every place I've lived in, the landlords have been taking out the playgrounds because they didn't want children. And she said, second, there's 3 bedrooms. And we had 3- and 4-bedroom apartments for larger families. She said, we couldn't find an apartment with 3 or 4 bedrooms. And traditionally, apartment builders build 2 bedrooms because they don't want to encourage large, noisy families, if you will. And so I had a very nice conversation with her, standing there on the second-story porch of her new apartment. I said, you know, I've got this idea, and I just wanted to ask you about what you think about it. And because being here is a wonderful step to stability. But what if we were able to create a matching grant program? So if you saved money while you were living here in Cedar Meadows, you would be able to earn for your savings a matching grant and use it as a down payment to buy a home. And she started crying. And she said, that would be the light at the end of the tunnel for me and for my kids. She said, that would be tremendous. I would love to participate in a program like that. And so at that moment, I thought, great, I must go ahead and create this kind of program. And the next development that I did, called Ankeny Woods, I wrote into the pro forma so that the funding of the apartment complex included funding to fund a matching grant program, which I called the Tenant Investment Plan. And so I started working on this, and I got an intern, and I said to the intern, the best strategy to develop anything is to steal other people's ideas. Surely somebody has done something like this. And so I sent her off to research, and she came back a couple of days later, and she said, there's this guy, Michael Sheridan. I think you've all heard of him, who wrote a book that it's fairly new. And of course, it was a 1991 book, and this was in 1995 now. And so she went and got a copy of it, brought it back. I read through the book. I called up Michael Sheridan. I talked to him. The main thing that resonated for me was that, first of all, I now had documentation that I wasn't so crazy in thinking about this idea. So when I went to the Portland Development Bureau and said, I want to write this into the pro forma of the apartment complex, they didn't think it was just me. It was like other crazy people were thinking that this made sense as well. Also, the emphasis that Michael put on the 3 paths of empowerment into the middle class, that is education, small business, and home ownership, and that you can do matching grants in these 3 areas. So it kind of broadened my thinking about what was possible, where I was coming to this from a perspective of simply home ownership. Well, that program became an early program that was a project matched by you all or supported by you all and morphed into something called PRIDA, Portland Regional IDA Program. Well, fast forward a couple of years, and I'm a newly elected state legislator, 1999, and someone came to me and said, you know, would you be interested in writing some legislation to create a framework for IDAs in Oregon? I'm like, are you kidding me? Of course I would love to. And I teamed up with a Republican named Ben Westland. And we wrote the legislation, created this framework. It had very strong support. As you have seen across the country, it's often hard to find things that Democrats and Republicans will embrace together. And this program, like Habitat for Humanity, as an empowerment program, as a hand up, not a handout, draws people from both sides of the spectrum. And so we passed that legislation that year, and then in 2007, when I was Speaker of the House, we increased the level of the tax credit, as you've heard, the 75% tax credit. Always felt a little guilty in that it's by far the most generous arrangement you could ever ask for, but it's generous in such a good cause that I don't feel that guilty. It's nice to kind of win one for families that will be changed through economic empowerment. And so I wanted to share a couple of a little bit of information about Oregon to follow up on what Andrea has mentioned to you. The Neighborhood Partnership Group had Portland State University do a study for a 4-year period, what actually is going on with these IDAs. And they found over that 4-year period, they looked at 4,000 Oregon residents who had opened IDAs. And those residents collectively had saved $5 million. 65% of those who opened IDA programs had graduated during that time period. That is, they had met the savings goal and received their match for one of the 3 purposes that continue to be at the heart of this: education, small business, or home ownership. About a third of those had purchased homes, and the average savings over an average period of about 18 or 19 months was $1,700, and the average match was $4,700. Kind of doing the quick math on that, we're talking about $6,400 was the average amount that a family applied in one of those 3 directions. But in addition to just the financial empowerment was the path that folks were set on, the path of building a small business, the path on returning to gain education, and the knowledge that they were taking onto that path. The study found that 73% of the families were regularly using a budget, and virtually none had been using a budget before they entered a program. The 67% were making regular deposits to their savings account, and very few had savings accounts in which they made regular deposits in advance. 60% had an emergency fund by the time that they had graduated apart from their IDA. And I think about the fact that during that 4-year period, the number that had bought a home was 1,289, so 1,300 new homeowners. And this is equivalent to the work that all of Oregon's Habitat affiliates have done. I went back last year to speak at a Habitat gathering celebrating the 1,000th house that Habitat had created and sold. When I became director of Habitat for Humanity, Portland Habitat for Humanity, they had sold 1 new home and I think 3 renovated homes in their first 12 years. So very modest amount of well, fast forward to last year, Habitat affiliates across Oregon, of course, many, many more affiliates operating much higher, 1,000 homes, which was tremendous work. Well, here another 1,300 families became homeowners. And in both cases, with Habitat and with the IDA path, folks had not just gained a home, they had gained a financial education and a home ownership education that put them on a path to financial stability from here into the future. One of the things that tremendously appealed to me in the course of this is that pathway that continues to reverberate for children. Children see their parents gaining a financial discipline. If it happens to be a small business, they see their parent launching a small business and start to see that as a model, as something that they might do. If it's going back to college, well, then they see a model of aspiration towards higher education. If it's home ownership, then things start to change in the way that the home is operated. No longer are you at the mercy of a landlord. No longer is there a landlord to call up. One of the experiences I had at Habitat is people would call me up and say, Jeff, I've got this problem with the house. Can you come fix it? And I got to say, well, actually, no, I can't. And I remember this one homeowner called me up, and the toilet had been plugged up, and he wanted me to come unplug the toilet. And I said, well, you know, guess what? You get to unplug that toilet. You want to come down here to the Habitat offices? You know, we'll talk about different strategies you can use. He said, well, you don't understand. My kids put these toys down the toilet, and it plugged it up. I said, well, yeah, I do understand that. And so you got to sit your kids down and talk to them about this because there's no longer a landlord to call. And you can just see this moment when it's like, this is my house. I have to take responsibility for this house. And the kids didn't see their parent calling the landlord. They saw their parent saying, okay, come in here. We got to fix this and don't do it again. And the children did better in school by far, and the statistics bear this out. The foundation of the stability and seeing the personal responsibility required. The kids do better in school. They do better at their homework, more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to attend higher education, more likely to have a paying job, more likely to stay out of trouble. The Habitat affiliate I was working for was right in the center of where the Bloods gang was operating. And this was the middle of the crack epidemic. Drug selling was rampant. It was a crazy community. I saw 3 incidents with guns in front of our little Habitat office, which was a little duplex that we had in the first 6 months I was there. Well, families were finding stability within an environment of chaos, and their kids were doing far better, which was very exciting. We're really talking here about 2 sides of an equation: asset building on the one hand, and stopping asset stripping on the other hand. And into this goes financial education because it serves on both fronts. I had proposed that financial education be a mandatory part of a high school education in Oregon. And we have 200 school districts. And the pushback I got was enormous. No more state mandates. We are completely stretched already. Do not tell us we have to add 1 more graduation requirement. And so my bill actually, it did not succeed. And I keep thinking, though, about how can any school board member look at what's going on in our society and not feel compelled to make financial education a part of a high school education. When I came out of graduate school and I came here to Washington, D.C., and I was working as a presidential fellow for Secretary Weinberger, I applied for a credit card, and I was turned down. I was turned down because I didn't have 2 years of employment history. Well, very different world from today. A world in which your children and your dog get credit card applications in the mail. A world in which we no longer have limits on the interest of consumer loans. So there are predatory payday loans everywhere in the country. Now, taking on those payday loans was something I felt very strongly about. I started in my first effort in 1999 when I was elected, but it wasn't until I was Speaker of the House in 2007 that Oregon was able to pass a group of 4 bills controlling payday loans and essentially taking them from an interest rate of 500% down to an interest rate of 36% as a cap, and to restore that as a cap on all consumer lending, because we saw the leakage that would occur in other states. You cap payday loans, it goes to title loans. You catch title loans, it goes to other consumer loans. If we on the asset building side are investing these resources here, but payday loan companies are stripping it with 500% interest rates over here, well then we're in a battle in which we're losing as much as we're gaining. So if we can stop that, and there's absolutely no reason there shouldn't be a nationwide cap on the interest rate on payday loans. We have a nationwide cap for service communities. Why? Because our generals and admirals saw the devastating impact of payday loans on their service members and said, this is undermining U.S. security. Well, what is good for a service member family, because it is not healthy for those families to be undermined by predatory financial strategies, it's good for every American family. Let's take that same model and make it for every American family. Another form of predatory or asset stripping has really hurt America, and that's when in 2003 these teaser rate mortgage loans occurred. And because home ownership is so near and dear to my heart, I was appalled that you had a bait in the form of a teaser rate, and then a trap in the form of a prepayment penalty that meant you couldn't get out of the loan, and then you had an exploding interest rate, and so the interest rates would blow up on the families, and the families couldn't make the payments. And the worst is that the mortgage originators were getting kickbacks called steering payments, undisclosed, and so I saw the families in my community. I still live in a working class community. I saw families go to mortgage originators, and the originators would say, home ownership has become so complex, but set yourself at ease. I am your financial counselor. That's what I'm paid to do. Wouldn't disclose the kickbacks they were getting to steer people into predatory loans. And 60%, with a Wall Street Journal study, 60% of the families that qualified, that were in subprime loans, qualified for prime loans. They could have had a 30-year low interest rate loan, and they got stuck in an exploding interest loan because they trusted the mortgage originator who was getting these kickbacks. One of the things that I did in Dodd-Frank was to insert language that essentially made prepayment penalties and steering payments illegal. And we have got to continue that fight as a community. We're interested in asset building. We've got to prevent 3 years or 5 years from now predatory practices re-emerging in mortgages. So I just wanted to broaden the discussion a little bit and say that while we're working on the asset building, let's also take on the predatory practices that strip wealth from working families. And if we can possibly do it, let's do everything we can to enhance financial education, because it's a crazy financial world that our students graduate into, whether it's the first day on campus when they're assaulted with credit card offers, or their first day when they're pursuing home ownership, that we don't want them steered into a predatory mortgage loan. And their personal education about financial issues makes such a big difference. A couple of the stories from Oregon, it was Stephanie Waller who painted her room green, her bedroom green, on that first night that she had keys. And she said, you can do whatever you want to your own house, starting with the day you get your keys. And then she talks about staying up all night painting her room. Or Natalie Mitchell, who got an IDA to buy a house through NIA, the Native American Youth Association. And she really applauded the fact that it was the homeownership class and the financial wellness class that she felt had put her on the path as much as the actual IDA itself. She was a single mother of 3, and she talked about how now her 2 daughters, and there's this picture of the 3 of them standing on their porch. Her 2 daughters, she wants them to be homeowners. So she's setting a culture that will carry on. Or Rosalind Patrick, she was a freshman in high school when a Neighborhood Works, the group is called Neighborhood or NeighborWorks Umpqua. An employee came in and briefed the kids on youth IDAs. They call it the Youth 3A IDA program. And she's decided, yes, I want to be part of this. And so she started saving her IDA dollars half into an account that allows you to buy assets related to athletics or art or academics. And she specifically had the goal of buying a laptop computer. She did buy this laptop computer, became the first computer in her house. And not only did it become a computer useful to her whole family, but she then, as an unanticipated side effect, used it to connect to the world and search out and get scholarships. So fast forward 4 years, she's in college with scholarships, has an affordable higher education path. And she said about her experience, and I quote, "It was my first independent responsibility type of thing, so that was really neat." That was her quote. And she has started doing presentations because she has such credibility with others, having gone through this, more credibility than most of us could ever have because she lived that experience. And what a better example of a hand up. Or Forrest James, a photographer in Ashland, Oregon, who didn't really have a business plan for his photography business, and the IDA program required him to attend a business class at a community college. And so he gives that experience, the required business class at Cascade, Oregon Community College, as much weight as the actual IDA program in which he was able to purchase equipment for his photographic small business, and Neighbor Impacts was the name of the group. We have 14 groups in Oregon, 17 groups that have IDA programs. So there's great diversity and experimentation and mutual reinforcing community as they explore new strategies, which new strategies brings us to Congress. IDAs have not been reauthorized. Legislation has not been reauthorized. It's way overdue. I am searching for a Republican partner, and this would not have been so difficult a few years ago. But the kind of lid put on any, quote, new program also has been interpreted by several of my potential partners in this to mean an expansion or reworking of any existing program. So I encourage all of you to be in contact with me or with my team. And Scott Rosenthal is here, who's, Scott, you want to raise your hand? Scott's here. Please feel free to contact him because your help and your relationships would be very, very useful in forging a bipartisan effort to reauthorize and expand several of the pieces of the IDA picture. I think the experience, the years of track record, the experience that so many of you have and organizations in the field have about what works and doesn't work can help us rewrite the IDA structure to make it far more effective. So with that, I thank you. I thank our hosting organizations for the work that they've done. I thank all of you for your interest, and I look forward to being a partner with you as we go forward to empower America's working families.
So I think we have time for one question. So who would like to be the questioner? Anyone? Yes. Justin, you stand up and introduce yourself.
Senator, thank you so much. I work with the Asset Building Program at the New America Foundation.
Justin, wait 1 second so folks can hear.
I'm Justin King. I work at the Asset Building Program at the New America Foundation. It's always great to hear your voice, whether at CFED or at New America, and certainly in the Senate. You speak with a lot of passion on these issues, and it's really something that I think is missing in the Congress a lot of times. So we're very glad to have you where you are, speaking in this voice. As we think about sort of the hot topics in Washington, we think about the fiscal cliff, we think about moving forward. One of the big things that we think about in our field is, are we allocating resources effectively? Because they are limited. We spent about $160 billion promoting retirement tax expenditures, retirement savings tax expenditures. This year, about $130 billion of that $160 billion goes to the wealthiest 20% of people. This is something that was identified in the Bold Citizens negotiation as a possible source for revenue to lessen the deficit. Oh, and I was holding so close to my mouth. But with all those resources available, are those resources something we're going to see as a topic for deficit reduction? But more importantly,
are we going to see any opportunities to take some of that $160 billion that goes to retirement savings and spread that money out so that we have a retirement savings system and a savings system that works for all 100% of Americans and not just the 20 wealthiest percent?
Yep. It's certainly true that many of the features written into the tax code that may have some help to middle-class families or lower-income families in empowering them have disproportionately more help to the wealthiest among us. Certainly that's true with the home mortgage interest deduction, for example, which is somewhere in the range of about a $70 billion a year program, to which the vast majority goes to very successful families. And but these are deeply entrenched, whether it's the home mortgage interest deduction or whether it's the fact that your IRA savings is off limits or doesn't go as a deduction on your taxes, but it's not taxable income, separate taxable income. I can't speak specifically to any given piece of the puzzle as the odds of what will be changed, but there is broad interest, and you're hearing some of my Republican colleagues talk about putting an overall cap on deductions, and I believe one colleague talked about a $50,000 cap. Well, that sounds like a lot of deductions to a working family, but that's actually a pretty serious cap as it's related to very successful families who have far more than that in deductions. I was very struck during the presidential campaign when I believe that Romney's stats were that he had over $2 million, wasn't it $2 million? $20 million in a retirement account. How is that possible? How is that possible? And there's a lot of speculation because we didn't have details, but the speculation was along the lines of, well, you put in options and you self-evaluate them at a very low value, but then they turn out, they're they're far more valuable. Well, so there's so many strategies where the most successful can essentially work the tax code, and taking those on is appropriate because Warren Buffett had a tremendously solid article about this. I believe it was in the Monday New York Times, in which he basically said this makes no sense to be spending so much in tax credits and deductions and low tax bracket levels for the most well-off among us, as he put it, like himself, Warren Buffett. And I hope that his voice resonates. But we've just gone through 2 years in which he was a similar advocate, and we've had this conversation, and essentially we couldn't move Congress in any serious direction. If we think about it, we have essentially a small number of Americans doing fabulously well, greatly multiplying their wealth. And we have working Americans whose income has been flat since 1974. 1974 is the year that I got out of high school. So for my whole adult life, working wages have been flat. Very different experience from my parents' experience, where their working years, they saw tremendous growth in the incomes of the real incomes of working families. And what is fascinating is to take and overlay a chart on workers' productivity with workers' real wages. And you find from World War II through 1974, they go right together. As productivity increased, workers' real wages increased, and all of American families were lifted up. And from 1974 till now, complete flat line, except that the last 10 years it's been downhill about 7%. So we see over more than 3 decades a paralysis of real success for working families, while the wealth of the best off has multiplied many, many times. Well, a lot of this is embedded in the structure of our tax code. So it was in 1976 that Senator Packwood from Oregon was head of the Finance Committee, and he basically led a major effort to restructure the tax system and take on a lot of the credits and deductions. In fact, the conversation excuse me, 1986. But the conversation was, well, you know, we hand out deductions and credits for 10 years, and then we pull them back in. There had been a bill in 1976 that I had worked on when I was an intern for Senator Hatfield that had done a more modest pulling in. And then you had 86. Well, then it would have been 96, except 96 never happened. In fact, there has been no effort to, the handouts keep going year after year after year. There's been no effort to pull them back in. So we have so many holes that are exploited by folks of means. I would hope that out of this presidential campaign, people will say, why do we have the ability for affluent people to have a Swiss bank account or a Cayman Islands strategy? Well, let's put the knowledge that came out of this presidential campaign to work to say we have to change. The tax code is an enormously powerful instrument and can be a huge partner in asset building for low-income and median-income families, and let's put it to work. So it's another area we should pay a lot of attention to. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I don't think there could be a more articulate, impassioned, or knowledgeable advocate for asset building in the entire Congress. So thank you very much, Senator Merkley. I also want to welcome our over 300 listeners on the webinar and hope you're enjoying it, even if you can't see us. And then my great pleasure to introduce Michael Tomasky, the editor of Democracy Magazine, to start the panel off.
I'll be very brief. It's not on. Let's try that. I'll be very brief because I, like all of you, want to hear this panel. I just want to say a few things. I want to thank Andrea Levere and everyone here at CFED, particularly Kristen Lawton and Kim Pate and Ann Kim, with whom we worked putting this symposium together. It was so easy, really, wasn't it? We were talking about it this morning, Andrea and I, from our first meeting, whenever it was, a year or so ago, and then we just had a few meetings about what the subject matter should be and who the writers should be, and we took it from there. They gave us a free editorial hand, which everyone in these circumstances doesn't always do, and we think it was a fantastic collaboration. So we're very grateful to CFED. I want to quickly acknowledge my colleagues, our managing editor, whom I see way back there, Albert Ventura. There's his hand in the air. Albert, I think it's fair to say, perhaps I'm being a nice boss, but I think it's accurate to say that he kind of took the lead in rounding up a lot of the authors for this symposium. Jack Meserve is our associate editor there in the front row, and Jack also worked very hard on editing these articles. Our intern I introduced, John Cheng, sitting here in front because he has a very important job this morning. You see he's holding signs that say 2 minutes, 1 minute, and time. And we chose him for that task because, as you can see, he's tall and intimidating. I finally want merely to introduce and acknowledge your moderator this morning, whom we selected. And if you don't know Jim Tankersley's work at the National Journal, you know, I want to take a second just to say a thing about democracy before I move it to you. And I know that the senator said very nice things about Elizabeth Warren's article. I assume many of you, I'll be presumptuous perhaps, and assume that many of you basically know democracy, and I hope you know what we do. For those of you who are being introduced to the journal this morning, I hope you'll give it a look and read through it. We think that this symposium is exactly in line with our mission to identify problems in the policy area and in society and propose ideas and solutions to address them. So whether you read this symposium or in this same issue, Kent Greenfield's article on corporate governance or Bill Galston's piece on elder care, These are pieces that all identify serious problems that we face and don't just complain about them, but propose solutions and ways to fix them. That's what we at Democracy do. We have a great issue coming up that will be released the first week of January. I hope you'll look for it. Now I can ladle praise on Jim Tankersley, whose work you should certainly know as the Chief Economics Correspondent of National Journal, who has really distinguished himself, I believe, in his time there, and he does a lot of coverage of issues relating to asset building, relating to income inequality, and myriad kindred subjects. So I'm very happy to turn it over now to Jim Tankersley. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much for coming. I'm just delighted to have this panel and to have you all here. Let's get right to it. I'm going to introduce the panelists one at a time. They're going to have brief presentations for you, and then we'll get into the discussion. So we're going to start with Ray Boshara, who is my favorite kind of person, which is to say a researcher at a Federal Reserve Bank. You might think I'm kidding. I'm not. Ray's a senior advisor at the St. Louis Fed, where he focuses on low-income family issues, and is a founder of the asset building program at the New America Foundation. So Ray, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, and here we are. Thank you, Jim, and Democracy and CFED. It's really great to be here. I sometimes forget that I'm a researcher at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Many of you know I cut my teeth doing policy at CFED and then at the New America Foundation. So basically the last 20 years, I've been wired to be doing policy and advocacy, and now I need to be reminded by my own colleagues in St. Louis and at the board that I am now a researcher, and accordingly must say that these, in fact, are my own views and not necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis or the Federal Reserve System. So with that, let me let me just briefly summarize some of the main ideas in my piece. I was asked to start off with a little bit of reflection about the first 20 years of the field. I was in this field even before Michael Sheridan's 1991 book was published. And I think in the kind of the debut phase, the first 10, 15 years of the field, I think three things kind of emerged. And if I can crudely summarize that experience in a few minutes, I will, if you'll let me do that, and apologies to the veterans in the room. I think we basically spent, the first thing was we tried to go from belief to proof, belief that the poor could save, and belief that assets matter. And I think we succeeded on both fronts. Senator Merkley gave great examples of how the poor could save and how assets matter. The second thing I'd observe about those first years was that I think we changed a lot of minds, but not a lot of wallets. We did, in fact, succeed in getting assets for independence into law, and that's a fabulous success and one that deserves an update and continuation. But other than that, we didn't really secure a lot of money, but we, as I mentioned, changed a lot of minds. We were so successful in changing minds that we had several multi-billion-dollar bipartisan pieces of legislation introduced throughout the 1990s and in the early 2000s, and around IDAs and children's savings accounts, USAs, but basically they went nowhere. And in fact, it's probably good that they didn't, because the policy was way ahead of the practice. We thought we knew what we were doing writing legislation, but we really didn't, because there wasn't much to base it on, sometimes 3 programs, sometimes 10, sometimes 15. But the fact that we could generate bipartisan support around multi-billion-dollar policies was really an achievement. So the policy was way ahead of the practice, and I think, of course, that's completely reversed now, that the practice is way ahead of the policy. And although we didn't secure a lot of money, I think the field did play a part in establishing the CFPB, which in fact is poised to affect the wallets of millions of Americans. And the third thing I'd say about the debut phase is that I think we eventually got smart about scale and got religion about behavioral economics. We succeeded with IDAs, but we also learned that we were smarter to make 401ks and 529s and IRAs look like IDAs. It was better to tweak products that existed rather than create new ones. We also learned that the matches are important for accumulating assets and for equity in the tax code, but if you wanted to generate savings, the matches were not the most important thing that mattered. And we also learned that individuals matter in their decisions and their financial education, but that institutions may matter more in determining who saves and who doesn't, nudges, automatic features, defaults, and things like that. So in my view, I think whether or not we do asset building is not really the question, nor is how we do it, although there are issues there. The big three questions are, what do we do, why do we do it, and for whom? And I think these are the three core questions going forward. Let me just say a little bit about the what, why, and for whom very briefly, if I may, and I'm seeing the signs already. So the what, look, I think the big idea here is that, as the Senator himself noted, that we have to go from asset building to household balance sheets. We have to broaden our perspective. We can't just think about savings and assets. We have to think about debt and the diversity of assets and the quality of financial services. You know, household debt, in fact, exceeded asset accumulation over the last decade, and the price of the American dream was, in fact, record levels of household debt. As a matter of fact, there were 4 balance sheet failures. About a third of Americans relied on wealth-depleting financial services. Secondly, by 2005, we had the lowest level of household savings since the 1930s. Third, our levels of debt, we had the highest debt to GDP ratio since the 1950s. And fourth, we had the highest concentration of housing, the highest concentration of wealth in housing by 2005 ever recorded. These 4 balance sheet failures, combined with a misguided faith in ever-rising asset values, actually brought the economy down. Nobody thought that the balance sheets of low, moderate, and middle-income people could bring the economy down, but they did. So, so the what is broaden our perspective. Secondly, why are we doing this? Very simple. You know, I've tried out dozens of arguments with policymakers left and right over 20 years on why asset building matters. And my bottom line is it matters for the stability and economic mobility of families, and it matters for the economic growth of our nation. Those are our 2 best arguments. Mobility, I think if you're not moving up, you're not really in America. And the economic growth argument, an economist, Amir Sufi, found out that 2 of the 3 jobs lost between 2007 and 2009 were because of weak household balance sheets. Well, if weak balance sheets can bring the economy down, then strong ones can build them back up. And we're talking about a very broad swath of the population whose balance sheets could be strengthened and which, when strengthened, would contribute to the growth of the nation. And finally, for whom? For whom? I think we have to be guided by the data. If we look at the data, who actually lost wealth in the recession? If you look at it by income, as Andrea mentioned, about a 40% decline across the board. All but the top 10% lost wealth. But if you look at the bottom 40%, the topic of today's discussion, it turns out, and if you broaden it to the 20 years since Michael introduced his idea, the very poor, 0 to 20%, actually are about where they were in 1992. They had about $6,000 in median net worth then, and that's about what they have now. More disturbing is the next rung of the ladder, the 20 to 40%, the working poor. They actually started the 1992 with about $42,000 in median net worth and ended it with $25,000. They had a huge, massive decline in net worth, which is very disturbing. So in the 20 years since Michael introduced the idea, the very people that we've targeted have either stayed the same or lost a lot of wealth, which raises real questions of downside risk that I think we need to manage. But then if you look at age, race, and education, it was younger, non-white, and less educated families that lost the most wealth. And young homeowners in particular really were walloped. Housing wealth was responsible for 40% of the decline for older Americans, 53% for middle-aged, and 75% of the wealth losses for younger Americans. And now half of all people under 40 have negative net worth. I'm sorry, negative home equity. So let me close just by saying that there's a lot of talking about the recovery is on the way, consumer spending is up. That's fine, but let's keep in mind that only about 2/5 of the wealth lost in the recession has been recovered. We've got a long way to go. And I'm reminded as well that Arthur Kennickel of the board just put out a paper showing that the top half of the country owns about 97% of the wealth, and the bottom 50% owns about 3%. Folks, we have a long way to go, but we have tremendous lessons to learn from this field and this big idea. And it's my hope that this boutique field is now ready for prime time. It can have a major impact on the tenor of the debate going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Next is Sarah Rosen Wartell, who is the president of the Urban Institute. She's co-founder of a little place you may have heard of called the Center for American Progress. And she's a former economic advisor to President Clinton and one of my favorite panelists from the time that we've spent together on past ones. So, Sarah, take it away.
Thank you. Well, first of all, which mic am I using? Not this one. Okay, it's working. So first of all, let me thank the Market Journal for providing a terrific forum for important ideas to make their way to the national conversation and to give them, forcing writers to write in clear, accessible prose, things that think tanks, Denison sometimes have a hard time with. It's really a very important institution. I'm proud as a CFED board member for this collaboration. I also want to thank the two co-authors I had on the piece that I wrote for the journal article, for the journal symposium. One was the truly inspirational Bob Friedman, who is a founder of CFED and all of the sort of in some ways the leading light, driving force, moral compass of all of the great work that CFED does. It's a great pleasure to serve on the board with him. And also a terrific Urban Institute colleague of mine, Yin Shi, who I really want to thank for having done an important part of the laboring or work on this. So it's very hard to follow Ray because he managed in his 7 minutes to say everything. So I'm going to find myself trying to elaborate on a couple of the points. With one, I would call it a friendly amendment. Let me start with a friendly amendment. I do believe that the evidence base for an asset policy has been laid over the last 20 years. But that's very different to say that the case has been made and won in the larger debate. Coming from having spent much of my life in the last 12 years in the progressive community, I will tell you that I still today have, okay, sorry about that. I still today am privy to plenty of conversations about the fact that when you're talking about people with very low incomes, is it really the case that they have the capacity to save when their incomes are as low and the costs that they face in just meeting the basic needs of their family are so high? And if you could convince, and if the poor are able to save, is that really what you should do for them if their standards of living are so low and the opportunities for their families so minimal? Is savings what you best recommend? And so what we tried to do in our article is to take on those two arguments, to review some of the evidence that my colleagues at the Urban Institute, that CFED, that Michael Sheridan, and many others, including Ray, have done to put that case out in, because I think the answer to that is absolutely right. Yes, the poor can save, and yes, the poor should save, and they should save not only for their own best interest, but ultimately because we as a society avoid very significant societal costs when they do, and we create an economic base that will ultimately make the pie bigger and our own economic growth. All of us are beneficiaries of that. But I'm not convinced that when push comes to shove, as appealing as in the bipartisan appeal of the ownership society vision is, that when it comes down to it, that case always wins the day. So what we tried to lay out in this is a number of the reasons why the poor, first of all, that the poor can save, and we went through quickly, and I don't need to do the details here, but some of the studies that demonstrate that even people whose incomes are as low as $17,000, $18,000 a year have been successful in raising over, in the New York City example with the New York City Savings Match Savings Program, or IDA participants saving $600 over a reasonable period of time, is actually for someone with a $17,000 a year income a very significant cushion that can help them avoid very serious hardships. Similarly, that my colleagues at the Urban Institute, Signa Mary McKernan and Carolyn Ratcliffe, have argued that, as Andrea talked about, that notion of financial solvency that is necessary for people to have, that it is in fact possible for almost 44% of low-income households to escape asset liquid poverty over 12 years if they develop a cushion. That's a very long time, but more than almost half of them are able to do that. And so yes, the poor can save. More importantly, why should they? They should save because if they have a savings cushion, they can avoid severe financial hardship. And hardship means not feeding your kids. Hardship means not having a place to live. Life for very low-income people is more volatile than it is for all of us, and we've all learned in the middle and upper middle class that there's not as much economic security as we once thought. Imagine if you're living on a very low income. So your ability, when those volatility moments come, to be able to survive them without real deprivation to your family is vastly improved by savings. It is also the case that if you have a small amount of savings, you avoid the worst of expensive, significant amounts of debt. Small amounts of savings mean you don't need to do the payday loan when the bill comes due for the car before you. Small amounts of savings mean that you can weather a short-term reduction in your hours and the like. So small amounts of savings are very important. It also has been shown directly to link, avoiding those moments of economic instability directly relate to the emotional and behavioral development of children and their ability to take advantage of the education and the like that they are offered, in part depends on the security of the home life and the availability to avoid severe financial hardship for their household. Finally, obviously small amounts of savings are a pathway, create an incentive, as someone called it, the tangible form of hope, that allows people to get to the investment in a small business, the investment in a child's education, the investment in home ownership. And I just want to say one thing we very briefly take on the article is the lessons that people are learning from the financial crisis, which is, I think, in some cases, the wrong lesson. The lesson that we're learning is somehow or other that home ownership is not a viable strategy for low and moderate income people. And I think what the right lessons to be learned from this crisis are really that we had a really toxic mix of stagnant incomes, low savings, loose availability of credit, and abundance of predatory products. And that toxic mix created home ownership that was not in anyone's best interest in many cases. But that doesn't mean, and my colleague Signa Mary McKernan has done work that shows that people who get access to home ownership, even with the enormous loss of wealth that we've seen, still ultimately have $44,000 more in savings over their lifetime than they have if they do not get access to. So it is really, ownership is still the best route that we have today to leverage, taking advantage of leverage for middle-income families. I believe we were going to continue to have a tax-favored system. I'm not saying we should. I'm saying we will have a continued, coming out of this political debate, system that with tax support for home ownership. And so we need to have a access to that that's more equitable and that, as we were talking about earlier, puts the subsidy in the places where it'll do the most to benefit people. Gaining access to home ownership for those who are ready and capable, which is not all that have been given access to credit in the past, is very important. There are lots of tools to help people save. Right-siding any number of the tax subsidies that we've been talking about, whether they are retirement, whether it is the homeownership, is a huge piece of it. There are obviously reforms that can be done to the saver's credit, and obviously stop penalizing people. This field, I think one thing Ray didn't touch, has done a lot of work to try to remove the disincentives to savings that exist in many federal income support programs, but we have not completed that work by any means, and we need to make sure that that effort continues, especially as we're putting in place reforms to all of the programs, the tax incentives going forward. So the sort of the bottom line for us was that yes, the poor can save, yes, the poor should save for their own best interest, and when we avoid those severe financial hardships to families, when we avoid the impairment to the emotional and psychological development of children, when we avoid the cost for people who are on the streets or without ability to weather volatility in their incomes, and when those people instead are productive members of society investing in their own businesses, in job creation, in their children's education, we actually spur growth that benefits all of us. So that's what we tried to reflect in this paper. In many ways, I think we're preaching to the choir here in this audience, but important for us to remember that not everyone is with us all the time. Thanks.
Finally, Jim Carr is a senior policy fellow at the Opportunity Agenda. He has a resume of research affiliations that would take us the rest of our allotted time for me to list off. But a couple of the more recognizable ones are the OECD and the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. So, Jim, please go ahead.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you, Jim. I'd like to thank Michael and Elbert at Democracy Journal for allowing me to contribute to that piece, and Elbert and Jack for a substantial amount of editing. Jack is smiling because my article was 4 times the length of the allowable. And I was also smiling looking at the intern as he now begins to understand why he was selected for this very important job of timekeeper. It's because the most frustrating job of a conference, since the speakers never pay attention to those cards. I'd like to just follow on the heels of Ray very quickly and offer my own qualifier as well. Even though I don't have an institution to qualify myself with, let me just say that my qualifier is that to the extent I say things that sound brilliant, insightful, and very thought-provoking, those are my views. If they sound a little bit off-key or inaccurate, just assume you misunderstood me. Now, my paper is titled Wealth Stripping, Why It Costs So Much to Be Poor. But it could have been titled Wealth Stripping, Should Government Inaction Be Included Within the Meaning of That Term? My paper diverges from many papers of its genre in the wealth stripping arena in that I move beyond traditional institutions that are associated with wealth stripping. Usually that term, and it's been pointed out today, is associated with payday lenders, check cashers, rent-to-own establishments, title lenders, and other financial services storefronts. These institutions have earned the title of wealth stripping, make no mistake about it. I cite in my article some recent research by Yannicka Ratcliffe, who's the executive director of the Center for Community Capital at North Carolina, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I cited hers because she just had some new stats, and I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to take a look at my article or just Google hers as well. But the average cost of a check cashing at a check cashing storefront now is about $40. So imagine you've got a check for $150, you're paying $40 for it. But that's a bargain compared to rent-to-own. She cites an example of a $850 computer, which once you get through paying for it on a term basis costs just under $4,500. And the reason is that people buy it on the basis of what it costs a week. In her example, she used $49 a week. Total number of payments over 21 months, 91. And she points out that subprime credit cards can come with fees. A subprime credit card with a $300 limit can come with fees of $250 already on the card. So they actually do deserve the term wealth stripping. But my paper moves beyond those institutions, and it raises the question of whether the government's failure to protect consumer and civil rights also should be considered wealth stripping. I do so because the tremendous loss of wealth over the last 6 years has principally been driven by the foreclosure crisis that had as its epicenter the financial exploitation of moderate, middle income, and communities of color, specifically in the subprime market. Senator Merkley pointed out exploding mortgages. He talked about them. One of the things the general public doesn't understand is those mortgages didn't just happen to explode. They were actually designed to explode. And the reason they were designed to explode was so that they would trigger an unaffordable payment, such that the borrower would have to come back and refinance to lower that payment and get stripped of fees. So it wasn't a mistake. And I think Andrea pointed out, and I forgot to thank her and CFED, of course, for the invitation to participate today as well. Andrea pointed out the substantial loss of wealth. The Pew Research Center indicates that Latinos have lost 2/3 of their wealth, African Americans and Asians more than half, and that the median American family has been set back 2 full decades in terms of wealth. So to ignore that while focusing on rent-to-own and payday lending, to me, is a major oversight. Now, it's sometimes said that the foreclosure crisis could not have been predicted. I'm amazed when I hear that. Who knew? Who could have known? Well, here's who knew. State after state after state, starting in 1999, where states were passing statewide anti-predatory lending laws directly in response to the fact that federal financial regulators knew about subprime lending, had conferences about it, and failed to regulate it. But not only did they not regulate it, they in fact set aside state laws through federal preemption that prohibited states from protecting their own citizens. Should we consider this wealth stripping? I think so. Now, my paper makes 2 additional points, and that is that since the Great Recession, alternative financial services providers are thriving, in large part because traditional financial institutions, banks specifically, have become even less accessible, particularly for lower income and low wealth households than they were before the crisis. Ratcliffe estimates that check cashing and payday lending storefronts today outnumber the total number of branches of all McDonald's, Burger King, Target, Sears, JCPenney, and Walmart stores combined by a few thousand. And these institutions serve the roughly 60 million adults who operate outside of the financial system, the mainstream financial system, which includes more than half of all African Americans and about 45% of Latinos and American, Indian, and Alaskans. Fringe lenders continue to profit and prosper because the fees at most banks have become unaffordable. And when you add in the cost of the fees, zero, almost no return on an average savings account, I think 0.1% is the national return, and inflation, you end up, if you are low wealth, basically paying the bank to hold your money. I don't think that that's what we meant when we were talking about asset building and becoming banked in the early to mid-1990s. As a result, encouraging the unbanked to go to a traditional financial institution conceptually is the right thing, but exactly how does that work? My final point in the paper is that in spite of the tremendous financial damage that has occurred, there is absolutely no public policy at a national level, none, that is aimed at talking about how do we recover from the wealth we lost. I find that to be just mesmerizingly confusing. It's as if the wealth has not been stripped away, none. In fact, Congress and the administration are all heading towards something called a fiscal cliff. What's wrong with that fiscal cliff is that you don't have to actually go over the fiscal cliff for it to be damaging to the economy and to consumers. You only have to keep going in that direction, and that direction is called austerity. The deficit did not cause the crisis, and the solution to the crisis is not reduce the deficit. That is not to say the deficit isn't important, and having been a senior staffer on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee during the time of the writing of Graham Rudman, I know deficits do matter. But there are 3 ways you can address the deficit. The first is on spending cuts, the second is on tax increases, and the third is something called economic growth. There is absolutely no conversation on what can be done to promote the economy, promote economic growth, put America back to work, and grow our revenue base as a way of balancing our budget. In my paper, where I ran out of time, or I should say ran out of space, I have a solution. It is very broad-based. And it builds on the heels of something that Sarah said, which is a lot of conversation right now is saying, well, we went too far on home ownership. Well, we didn't go too far on home ownership. We went too far on exploitation of consumers trying to get into home ownership. In an environment where we have 10 million vacant and abandoned properties, we have 3.5 million households that are 60 days or late delinquent, which means more foreclosures coming. And we have the lowest interest rates, mortgage interest rates in history. This is a ripe opportunity to help figure out how do we leverage this unique environment of affordable housing and affordable interest rates for low wealth households. There's no discussion on that. Most of the discussion, including by the federal agencies, is on how to get investors to buy those properties and turn them into rental properties so that low wealth people struggle to pay their rent in perpetuity. We need to figure out a way to build wealth, and housing has been historically the most significant wealth driver in America. And so I'll conclude by saying my proposal, which I just wrote about a few days ago in an article in Shelter Force, is that we need to create a new housing finance system that is as evolutionary as it was in the 1930s when we had a similar crisis. That's when we developed the Federal Home Loan Banks, the FHA, the Fannie Mae. We need a new housing finance system. And that system would include a housing and community infrastructure bank, so that we not only create innovative products to get people into home ownership, we also pay for construction and renovation of rental housing. We connect the two. We actually rebuild streets, roads, sewers, schools, recreational centers. We do what candidate Obama called for repeatedly in 2008. We repair America's infrastructure as a way to build jobs, build a green economy, leverage housing for wealth creation as well as job creation. And that was the part that we cut out, Albert. And I thank you and look forward to your questions.
The good news is you all get to query our panel after our discussion here. The better news is we're going to set you up for it by having a little discussion of our own to start. So a whole bunch to get to, and I'm intrigued by very much by this idea of a new housing finance mechanism and how to make that work. But let's get to that in a minute. I want to start with Ray. Repairing balance sheets for consumers, as Amir Sufi and Mian have written about, as you put it, may be the key to growing this economy. Mm-hmm. So what's the most effective, both cost-effective and in terms of effective way that the federal government could be doing that right now?
Well, and I'll let Jim offer details, but we got to get this negative equity off of household balance sheets first and foremost. It's about 3/4 of the debt on household balance sheets is mortgage debt. So I defer to Jim on the specifics, but it's the critical balance sheet challenge. Secondly, I think the only way we recover this kind of wealth is to start early. We have to start the whole process early in life, and schemes to support children's savings accounts, I think, are critical. We've learned that asset building is a lot like nutrition and music and education. The earlier you start, the better. Third, I think while housing is critical, and I totally agree, I think more importantly, we have to diversify the asset base of families. Families need a small stock of flexible assets to deploy through their lives, including housing, but going beyond. As I mentioned, we reached historic levels of concentration of wealth in housing. We have to correct that. And finally, I'm sorry, two last things. Short-term savings. This field started off with saying the poor need long-term assets, and they do. We've learned, we've backed into the fact that families probably need more short-term unrestricted emergency savings. It's critical for the stability and mobility of families in repairing balance sheets. Emergency savings cut across the health of the balance sheet. And so I think whatever we can do to achieve that. And finally, think small and think big. Think small about tweaks to 401ks and default settings, split refunds, retirement schemes, that generate large amounts of savings and then don't cost very much. And finally, think big. When there's billions or trillions of dollars on the table, we have to think about things like the Aspire Act or the Savers Bonus, which provides subsidies and matches for low-income families to save and build wealth.
Okay, so now I want to open this up to the whole panel, and anyone take this who wants. But let's build a first 100 days agenda here. If you were trying to get a bill passed, and let's think in practical political realities here too, that could really help to do a lot of what Ray's just talking about. What would be in it? What do we start with?
Well, I was just going to comment on that question, but also go back to Ray's point about the balance sheets, which are imbalanced. Depending on whose estimates you're using, there's somewhere between $700 billion to $1.1 trillion of mortgage debt outstanding that is considered underwater, meaning that exceeds the value of the underlying property. That is a weight not just on the housing market, but a weight on the economy. As you can imagine, if you're sitting in a home that you paid $400, you got a mortgage for say $250,000 on it, and the house is worth $125,000. That's a real weight. You're not going to be going out and spending. And so we need to get that under control. We also need to get that under control specifically for the housing market itself, because the longer you sit with that debt upside down, the more you begin maybe to think, oh, maybe I should just go into foreclosure. Well, we've had over 11 million foreclosure filings since 2007. We are not yet out of the woods. One of the most frustrating things is we seem to be in denial because we have some good numbers on house prices stabilizing and new construction and new sales. But if you look at any one of those numbers, you can pull them apart. They're very, very thin numbers. And so we need to get that balance sheet under control. One of our biggest impediments is that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are not participating in principal write-down, even though there's a federal program fully funded and being encouraged by the Treasury Department, encouraging Fannie and Freddie's regulator to allow them to do principal reduction, which, by the way, would save a net $1 billion if they did. But for some reason, the Federal Housing Finance Agency will not pursue that. So one of the first things I would say is get that agency on board on principal reduction. Most economists will tell you the economy will be stuck in neutral until you do something with that enormous debt. Sarah.
A couple of thoughts. First 100 days is, unfortunately, a lot of the things that we might want to do on savings are not likely to be first 100-day agenda items, unless the vehicle for them is while they're doing other things to the incentives that we currently have to save. Most of the mechanisms, I think, have a politically realistic chance of passing, are not going to try to get into the innards of many of these tax expenditures. I think the cap is probably a more likely path. And in some ways, that's unfortunate, because if you start to try to dial back the cost of some of the tax expenditures, you start to also have an opportunity to rationalize them. We should welcome an opportunity to try to rationalize the home mortgage interest deduction, which would be something where you would turn it into a credit. You would gradually, over time, reduce its value. And by making it a credit, it would be available to many more low-income people almost instantly. And the argument will be that it will have a dramatic effect on home values. There's research going on right now that suggests actually it could be stabilizing to middle-class home values, because the credit would become available to the vast majority of homes. People aren't taking the home mortgage interest deduction because middle-class homeowners don't have enough income to itemize. So getting into the innards of the home mortgage interest deduction, beginning to look at retirement savings incentives and looking at them and trying to figure out a way to use that to create some kind of refundable credit, those opportunities would be on my first 100 days, and it would be done in the larger context of deficit reform, which is really the only thing this country is going to be able to talk about in the near term.
If I could just add something, Jim. To me, one of the first things that needs to happen, as in like today, this morning, is we need to be having an honest conversation about where the economy is going. The last 3 recoveries were led by housing. Right now, housing is not like it's, in the last one, unfortunately, was a bubble. Well, we don't have the bubble. We have a deficit housing market. So the question is, what replaces that? And there's no conversation about that at all. What is going to drive job creation? No conversation at all. What can be done to actually deal with the deficit through investment in America? No discussion at all. So what I would say, the first priority is have an honest discussion among any policymakers who are interested in what will drive this economy going forward and how we can avoid this conversation of fiscal cliff only on spending and taxes, which is not a winnable solution for the economy.
Jim is sort of speaking my language here. I think I lost count of the number of stories I wrote during the election saying, hey, guys, this is an election about the economy. Really, the growth and 12 million unemployed people, we've got to deal with this now. But that's not the conversation we're having right now. The conversation we're having right now is about the deficit and about the fiscal cliff. And I want to go back to something that Sarah was just talking about. If we're thinking about tax reform, and we are talking about maybe not very useful incentives that we have that cost a lot of money for savings, the question that Senator Merkley fielded, can you all answer that? Should you all be pushing for changes to those programs that cost a lot of money and do not have great benefits in terms of savings?
I would just point out that a study was written up in yesterday's New York Times about the Danish retirement system and the lessons for the U.S. It turns out that the systems are very similar. They found out that every dollar in tax subsidy resulted in 1 cent of additional savings, but that autosave, autopilot, default settings actually generated enormous and significant amount of savings, especially among people who they called passive savers. So I think the evidence base is increasingly clear, that these incentives are not getting us very much in terms of savings, and certainly not for the people who need it the most.
I would say I think that's absolutely right. I think the notion that we have an opportunity when these items are on the table to begin to think about them, but in typical fashion, the minute you put a large tax expenditure on the table and you take some of the money, you're in a battle for where does the money go. And the only conversation that's happening right now is about how much of that money goes back to deficit reduction. And what I think the folks who are on asset building side would like to argue that you take, recognize the political realities, big chunk of any savings that's found from tax expenditures, you have to go to deficit reduction right now. But can we take an additional 5 or 10%, which is big money for the assets field, and try to reallocate it so that it is used to incentivize savings at the low end on the belief that that's ultimately going to be more stabilizing to growth. Now, the housing subsidy debate is going to be is dicey because you do have a case where the housing market expectations are built, I would argue, much more perception than reality around the home mortgage interest deduction. And so one of my favorite polls from last year was done by National Journal, actually, I think with Prime America, which looked at home ownership questions, and the enormous percentage of the population, like 60-some%, said that they do not get any benefit from the federal government to support their housing, and yet an enormous percentage claimed that they took the home mortgage interest deduction, far higher than actually take it. People are proud of taking the home mortgage interest deduction. In fact, they can't. Most of those people cannot. So the optics around the home mortgage interest deduction and its effect on a very fragile housing market is going to make that a very complicated conversation. But I do think that the evidence base, as opposed to the political reality around that, means that is the sort of the most live on the table subsidy pot that we could at best argue for a small piece of being reallocated.
But, right, and then I want to jump to Jim on a housing follow-up.
But even if you can't secure the subsidy, we've learned that you can do a lot without a subsidy to get the plumbing in place and to get the system started. I would urge, take the Roth. You can tweak a Roth and create a kid's Roth. One small change wouldn't cost anything, would create a tax benefited lifelong account. For adults, you can tweak a Roth and create what I call a rainy day Roth. You have Roths for long-term retirement and asset building purposes, but what about a Roth for everyday savings? So, keep these short-term, longer, very inexpensive tweaks to existing products on the table that would get the plumbing in place and set the foundation for funding to come later on.
Okay, so Jim, we're after assuming we actually ever finish this fiscal cliff conversation, which I suppose we can hope for, right? We will move on probably in the next year or so to a much more detailed conversation about housing finance. Particularly with the government being so heavily involved right now, I think 95% of all mortgages are being underwritten by some GSE. What are the opportunities there? And more than just getting rid of Ed DeMarco at the beginning, what should be the priorities as lawmakers look to fundamentally restructure housing finance?
Right. So I want to respond to that, but I just want to echo something that Sarah said, because I think she hit the nail, which is there are enormous opportunities within the tax code to actually eliminate a lot of tax preferences which really don't do much of anything, and in fact may be doing all the wrong things, subsidizing the wrong populations. The problem is if the conversation is focused on deficit reduction, then once you identify that opportunity, it's gone for purposes of channeling it to something more economically productive. In terms of the housing market, I firmly believe that given the fact that it was housing which was the core of the loss of wealth, we need to get back to that. And going all the way back to the Great Depression, we understood back then, 80 years ago, that housing, it wasn't just about housing finance, by the way. It was a recognition that housing construction promotes jobs. And so the FHA had as much of a driver behind it, job creation, as it did helping people to afford a home. And so I think we need to get back to that. I think we need to think more broadly about the housing finance system. I think when you're looking at house prices that have been, have not been this affordable in more than a decade, and then if you look at distressed properties, even more affordable, and historically low interest rates, never had them this low, not using that as an opportunity to say, you know what, the crisis was bad, but this is our opportunity to actually potentially emerge from this crisis stronger and better than we were before, exactly as we did during the Great Depression, except we don't have big thinking right now. And I think that that's a problem and a limitation. So I think to your question, two things. One is, it's not clear how strong the economy is. So when you say, well, we'll be beyond the fiscal cliff, I'm not sure exactly what that means, because it's not clear how we continue to muddle along at 1.5% GDP. At some point, it seems that either has to do better or it's going to do worse. And if we're not having any economic stimulus at all, then it's a mystery to me how this economy does better. So maybe if the economy does worse, that will sort of ring the alarm bells that people don't seem to be hearing right now, and actually drive policymakers to doing something more fundamental.
Well, okay, but let's sorry. Are we done? Okay. We are ready to move on to audience questions. Is that right? We can take one. Anyone? Okay.
Hi, my name is Meredith Dotson from the Grassroots Lobby Results. I'm wondering, I like a lot of the ideas about the longer-term savings, but I'm glad folks have also touched on the kind of emergency or short-term savings. And I'm wondering if y'all could talk about any opportunities. And maybe, Ray, you're getting at this with your rainy day Roth, but if it's not, if it's not refundable or some way doesn't get to people, lower income taxpayers who don't have tax liability, I'm worried that some of these tweaks aren't going to actually reach the folks who need emergency savings the most. So I'm wondering if you have anything you'd want to add around like first 100 days opportunities to build kind of emergency savings.
There's a few ideas that are floating out there. What's hard about that idea is that we don't do it for the non-poor, so we don't have the template like we do with the rest of the asset building agenda. So we're kind of trying to figure this out. But maybe you could, a lot of people over withhold their taxes as a form of savings. Maybe we could formalize that in some way and steer it into an account. Maybe we can think about a prepaid card that's low cost and has a savings bucket. Possibly we can think about a more universal CD, a short-term CD that has its core emergency savings. There's more you can do with savings bonds, I think as well. And then auto save, which is automatic payroll deductions going into a non-restricted savings account in the private sector, has been tested and has some potential. So I would look into those ideas.
I think the concept of rainy day savings is an idea that has a variety of appeals, especially at this sort of larger. And part of the way to get at things that will be important at the low income is also to think about them as a larger, more macro concept. And so piggybacking back into the housing debate, where I don't think we're going to be doing first 100 days housing finance reform legislation. I don't think we're going to be, I think we're going to be doing a lot of regulatory action before we get to it. But I think that one of the products that one of the GSEs started with in the late 90s, but then kind of got swallowed by the subprime market, was a mortgage product where you got, you were encouraged to build up a rainy day fund for low-income borrowers who were going to be more credit impaired. Having that rainy day fund was actually one of the things that gave you advantages in your mortgage. You could eventually, you know, adjustable rate interest would come down, I think was the way that product was designed. But in any event, you could, there are ways in which you can give people who might otherwise be more credit impaired an incentive if they have savings. And I was particularly excited by Senator Merkley's discussion of the way he came to his IDA interest, because I think we ought to go back to that insight. The idea of pairing rental rental housing opportunity with a piece of match savings through your rent payment as a mechanism to help people build and accumulate for home ownership. You could do it for a home ownership incentive. It's probably going to be easiest to do it that way. But you could also do a rainy day fund through housing subsidy or housing delivery system.
The family self-sufficiency account.
Family self-sufficiency, but that's a very niche product, I think it's fair to say, and I think you could take that concept. So looking at existing and new products, the other thing I'll say, just because I got the last word here, when we get to housing finance reform, there's going to be a real conversation about equity, and everybody's going to want to make sure that that borrowers have more skin in the game, meaning bigger down payments. And one of the things that I am concerned about that sort of bigger down payment concept is that people are going to come up with this idea that, you know, we're going to take a pot of government subsidy and I would argue very expensively give down payment support to certain low risk but low wealth borrowers. My view is that ought to be used in an incentive form in a match savings and that kind of thing. And that I anticipate when we see something that comes out of the administration that there's going to be a real focus on down payment accumulation, and that will be a real opportunity for asset building proponents to think about creating mechanisms in down payment accumulation.
All right, sorry, that really is the last word. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to our hosts and thanks to our panel.
So before you leave, I want to do 3 things, as I always do. 1, thank the extraordinary panel and moderator, and Jim has graciously agreed to do this again. Thank Democracy for their wonderful symposium, and I want to offer you my big 3 ideas that I've heard out of this. So 1, and we began with Senator Merkley, is the magic of financial capability. When we started 20 years ago, we didn't know what that word was. We didn't use that word. That word said, how do you take education and apply it to make good decisions? And Senator Merkley was extraordinarily eloquent when he talked about you're on a pathway, and a pathway goes for a lifetime. That's what we're thinking about with financial capability. Number 2, we have to advocate a split screen agenda. He was very clear about that. We have to build assets through incentives and removing obstacles, and we have to protect assets. Jim was incredibly prolific in all the ways we haven't done that. It's both mainstream financial institutions, alternative financial institutions, innovations in the bad way we haven't even thought about, and how do we keep focused on that in a very important way. And finally, we have to do big thinking, and Ray began the big thinking by talking about that the argument is stability and mobility, and also thinking about economic growth. Sarah was very clear that there's all sorts of big platforms we can think about, whether it's the down payment or a topic that nobody raised today, which I have been thinking about, which is the Affordable Care Act, which people are saying could be as powerful as platform as tax time in helping to build assets in new ways. And as well, how we take the evidence and make more believers, because I think Sarah was accurate, we still find people who should be in our court who are not yet there by seeing this in action. One of the most important trends that we've seen is this trend of integration. And one of the things every day, a housing authority comes to us, a preschool center comes to us, a healthcare facility comes to us and said, we can't achieve our goals if we don't build financial education and security into our programs. That's the other huge platform which then helps generate the kind of revenue streams that are coming. And the wonderful point, I think Jim made it, is that, oh no, I think Sarah made it, which we've talked about for years, is a little bit of tax savings for the country is a huge asset building investment for this field. It doesn't take that much. I think Ray calculated $4 billion opens a children's savings account for every child born in America on a year. Right. So with that, this webinar will be posted by the end of the week. We're going to have many more of these, so we're going to start engaging Jim regularly. And I want to thank all of you, both online and here, for coming.